Hi, I'm Jay with Valley Fisher Rods. Today I want to talk to you about making bamboo rods. Here I've got a finished bamboo rod. This is a Spring Creek rod, and I want to show you in steps how we go from going from a comb like this to the finished product. Okay? So we start with a bamboo comb or a pole. Okay, and these come in typically 12-foot lengths. This is cut in half here, and typically I'll make a check split when I get these because they'll split by themselves otherwise. And the longer these dry, the better. So some of these have dried for probably about 5 or 6 years. And then I use a throw, which is basically just a piece of iron that I kind of machine into. It's not really a knife. This is called a froe, and it's not sharp at all. It doesn't have a sharp edge. It's just a little sharp here so that I can make a check split, and then I just use a mallet to make my check split down the middle and cut it in half. So I'd be cutting it like this to make the halves. Okay. Typically I'll flame these too. These are unflamed, but flaming them puts a temper on them. Flaming involves taking it like a propane torch or some other flame and just toasting it like you would a marshmallow. Okay. After I get the halves, after I get them cut in half, then I will cut them into strips like this. There's going to be 18 strips for my rods. There's 6 strips that go into each section, and I typically have 2 tips on each rod that I make. So I typically split out enough where I have 18 strips like this. And here, this green one is for the butt section, and these 2 orange ones are separated for the tip sections. Okay. Then when I'm ready, I'll set these out on my table, and I will measure them to a particular node spacing. On the rods, there's something called a node, which is a leaf node, or a leafy area on the bamboo. The leaves kind of grow out of these areas here and then dry off and fall out. And these have been selected so that there's not very many leaf nodes or anything left on there. It's just nice clean bamboo all the way around. But this is a weak spot, or what we consider a weak spot on the rod, so we have to handle that in certain steps to improve the strength and straightness of the rod. So these are nodes right here, okay? And when I lay these out, there's different node configurations that we use. One is a 2x2x2, one is a 3x3, and then there's a Garrison configuration where we space them out in the firing pattern of a 6-cylinder engine. There's also random and a few others out there as well. Okay, so the next thing I do is soak them a little bit in a soaking tube. I soak them for 2 or 3 days, and these are some strips that I've soaked, and you notice that they turn a darker color. Bamboo gets darker when it's soaked. Now these have been cut to length, and you can see that the nodes are staggered on these. Okay, so they're not adjacent to one another. All right. So there's 6 strips here. This is for a tip section, and these would, if these were in order, they would go in the order of a 6-cylinder firing pattern. Okay, and I worked on these this morning. See how they're already a lighter color? I've gone ahead and processed the nodes on these, and there's some really subtle features on these nodes that you have to be aware of that you only see after you've worked on these a long time. There's actually something called an S-curve in here, and it almost is shaped like a letter S. There's kind of a bow this way, and a little bow this way, and then another one this way. And I use a heat gun and a vise and pliers and other apparatus to work these out. If you use a heat gun and heat this up, it's just like, you know, when you're bending wood, it's easier to bend, and it's less likely to break. Another thing we do is depress the nodes. So I'll heat this up and I'll press them in a vise, and then that straightens the power fibers that run through it, and it actually makes it a little bit stronger. It weakens the structure of the node, but when it aligns the power fibers, it actually makes this section stronger. So that's what I've gone ahead and done with these this morning. Okay, so this is the butt section here. This is a little bit thicker than, I don't know if you can see that on here. This is a tip section that I did this morning. And you know, there's a taper on the rod, so the butt section is going to be thicker than the tip section. Okay, so these are heating fixtures here. And I put them in the heating fixtures because the next step is to put them in an oven. And it's a special oven. You can't buy these in the store, you have to make them. And we temper these at about 390 degrees for about 15 minutes or so. It varies depending on what kind of temper we want on the rod. But we'll use these heating fixtures to bind them, and then that helps straighten them out also. Right? So after they're tempered, then I've got these strips, and I use a special form in order to make the final plane on the strips. And that's what we use to put the taper on the rod. These are a couple examples of some tip strips. You can see they're thicker here, and then they progressively get thinner up toward the top. And 6 of these would make a tip for a rod. Okay? And after I get the 6 done, then they look something like this here. This is actually a butt section for a rod that hasn't been glued yet, but it's been final planed. So this one's ready for glue. And you can see that I've put some binding thread on here. Actually, it's a different binder that binds in both directions and binds evenly throughout the whole rod. And I use an epoxy glue that they use for making bows. It's like a Hexion adhesive, and that works very well for binding these strips together. Okay, so after it's been glued up and it sits for 18 hours, then I put it back in the oven and let it cure for about 4 hours at 180 degrees. I'll take that out and take the binding strips off, or the binding threads off, and sand it. And this is a finished tip. This one has been sanded, and this is ready now to build into a rod. So those are the basic steps that you use to finish a rod. Let's talk about some of the tools that I use. Alright, so I was talking about planing the rods. So at this stage here, where I just have them soaked and I'll be pressing the nodes and everything, after the nodes are all pressed and everything's been straightened, I will go ahead and rough plane these. I use this wooden apparatus here, this planing form. It has 2 sides on it. The first side is to put the initial taper on there. And I'll put it this way in the form. It has a 30-degree angle and a 52.5-degree angle. And that you only put this in for the initial angle. Okay, so I'll put that in this way. I'll use my rough planing iron, and I will plane just like this, just like peeling carrots, going along here, and then that puts a little bevel on here. After that bevel is on the whole side, then I'll flip it over, and now this is going to be 30 degrees on both sides here. Okay, so the enamel will actually go in the other slot here, and I'll do the opposite side, and that will turn this rectangular shape into more of a triangular shape. So once I have 30 degrees on each side, I'll have my 60-degree angle on there. Okay. This is another planing form that I use. This is a metal form, and this is to get them down to a little smaller thickness. This is kind of a handy planing form to use for roughing. Some people use a beveler. It's kind of tedious work, and over time you get kind of tired of planing, so some people use power equipment to do that. I still do everything by hand. Okay. This is a planing form. This is a final planing form here, and I'm just going to show you there's some adjustments. Every 5 inches there's some set screws, and there's a channel that goes the length of the whole planing form. And you can set these screws to the taper that you want. And each rod would have a taper number at each one of these stations. And you would set the depth to where you want to plane. And then you would take your strip after it was rough planed and tempered, and you would put it in here, and I would use a rod maker's plane iron in order to shape it. And I would just go along like this, and I would shave bamboo off of it. And a well-tuned plane will make these nice shavings at about 2/1000ths of an inch. Okay? And you would plane both sides of these and walk that up until it was even with this channel. It's sort of like making an inlay. And then once it's flat, then you would scrape it with either a scraping plane, or I like to use a razor blade just to get the final bamboo removed so that it's flush with the planing form. Then you'll do 6 of those strips, and each of those 6 strips will make a blank. And that's basically how we get to that. After we have all of our blanks glued up, and we'll have a butt section, we'll have 2 tip sections, then we'll build ferrules, or we'll build the rod by putting ferrules on it, and we'll put a cork grip or some other material grip on there, reel seat, and all the reel hardware. We'll put a stripping guide, and then depending on the length of the rod, sometimes there's snake guides on the butt section. There's typically 2 of them on longer rods. And then the tip takes quite a while to wrap because there's quite a few guides. And at that point you can embellish it as much as you want with tipping wraps, winding checks, cork checks, or whatever you like. But that's essentially how we get from a bamboo pole or culm to a finished product rod.